Midnight in Boston. Fog like wet wool pressed against the gas lamps, and the city held its breath. On the 12th night, just as every clock struck 12, the sound rose again, muffled, sonorous, petit. A bell from beneath the cobblestones, ringing from a basement that had not existed since the church above it was torn down 50 years earlier. The notes were not loud, but they were exact, as if someone had polished them to a mirror shine silver over black, a measured bronze heartbeat under the street. Dockworkers crossed themselves. Policemen pretended not to hear. Children counted the tolls through their shutters. 12 nights, 12 tolls, each one landing in the ribs like a quiet verdict. The city ledger kept its neat rows, but the faces in the ledger the living ink of boson smeared at the edges. No one wanted to be the first to lift the streets and discover what knew how to keep time without light. I stood at the corner of Charta and Blackstone with a municipal key and a lantern whose flame wore a crimson halo. In the mist, the iron ring from the manhole was cold, slick, stubborn. When primera poi the city seemed to lean closer, as if to listen for the bell as the next breath. Behind me, a crowd swelled and shrank, unsure whether to witness or flee. The fog took their outlines and left only eyes gray, reflective, coin-bright. On the 11th stroke, I felt it before I heard it. A pressure through the soles, a deep, chapel-dark vibration, traveling up bone and memory. On the 12th, the tone resolved into something like a word. Not English, not anything I recognized, but every person on the street turned, all at once, to the exact spot where the old nave would have been, as if a conductor had lifted a baton they couldn't see. A bell is only a vessel. It speaks when it is struck. But who, beneath stone and steam and 50 years of forgetting, was doing the striking? And why did the sound carry a cadence that matched the pulse in my throat, steady, inevitable, counting down rather than up? The manhole shifted, as though something below had exhaled. Then the fog breathed back. By noon, the fog in Boston had thinned to a charcoal gauze, but it never truly left. Word of the midnight bell spread like coal dust along the wharves and into parlors where the curtains were always half drawn. The police called it a prank. The newspapers called it a marvel. The city clerk called me. My trade was measurement depths, spans, foundations that did not argue. Nothing in my ledgers prepared me for a note that kept time inside stone. 50 years back, the parish of St. Mather's had stood on this corner brick shoulders. Bronze cross, a bell said to have the clean, winter brightness of a struck coin. After the fire, the nave was pulled down and the basement filled, tamped, paved. The bell, if you believed the records, was shipped inland and sold. But records prefer neat endings. Streets prefer secrets. When I came with my lantern and municipal key, a small assembly waited. Sergeant O'Rourke, a gruff metronome with a badge, Elisa Hart, a reporter whose pencil moved like a violin bow, and Reverend Talbot, a spare man from another parish who insisted bells can remember prayers when people forget them. Eliza had found a notice from 1836. The bell's caster marked it with a single Latin motto non revertitur, it does not return. She smiled when she told me. Except it has. At dusk, the lamplighters kindled their narrow constellations. As the first flames steadied, I walked the old footprint of the nave, counting paces, tracing absence. A map formed in my head, where the altar would have risen, where pews would have creaked, where the steps would have led down to the vestry. Each place felt faintly colder, as if the fog pooled there by choice. The manhole at the curb wore a halo of damp. From below, the city's hidden rivers spoke in a language of drip and echo. Midnight, O'Rourke said, glancing at the sky that had no stars. Elisa held her notebook close, as if it might warm her. I set the key into the iron ring. Metal answered metal with a soft, private chime. Before we descend, join us in this investigation. Tell me, in the comments, the city and country where you're watching from. Where you stand matters more than you think. The iron disc of the street lifted with a complaint of old hinges, and the air that came up from below was colder than the night above. It's stone-cold, cellar-cold, the kind that carries a hint of iron and old paper. Our lanterns threw their thin halos down the mouth of the manhole, and found the suggestion of a ladder slick with condensation. The crowd that had gathered along Charter and Blackstone faces pale moons in the fogland as one organism. Even their whispers felt damp. "Quickly," said Sergeant O'Rourke. Not because haste was needed, but because authority prefers verbs. He checked the revolver under his coat, as if it were a rosary. He did not draw it. We were not descending against thieves or we were descending to listen. Eliza Hart lifted her skirts enough to reveal boots, scuffed by curiosity, handed me her notebook to tuck into my satchel, and tested the first rung with a journalist's courage fear acknowledged, then filed. Reverend Talbot crossed himself with a motion so restrained it might have been mistaken for dusting his lapel. He murmured something that stirred the mist near his lips like a moth's wing. I could not hear the words. Boston, United States, had been built in layers mud, timber, brick. Ambition then, replated with streets and reason. But reason is not stone. It does not carry weight. Stone beneath us did. I went first, lantern looped to my belt, municipal key tucked away. The ladder descended 10 rungs, 15, 20, into a brick culvert that felt like the inside of a throat. We stepped off onto a narrow shelf. To our right, the culvert widened into a walkway long since claimed by damp. To our left, a black channel whispered a slow secret. The city's hidden water, moving without urgency or apology. The lantern light coined off the surface in silver fragments and died a few feet out, as if someone had been skim-collecting shine for years. We walked single-file my lantern. O'Rourke's muttered cautions, Eliza's pencil clicking against her thumbnail because the habit was stronger than darkness. Talbot's soft shoes, soft prayers. The world above, compressed into a thin lid of cobble and fog. Every now and then the sound of a wagon rolling overhead approached and receded like a tide. It made the walls quiver just slightly, as if remembering newer brick. St. Mother's would have run from that manhole to there, I said, indicating a section where the brickwork changed from municipal red to an older, darker coarse, more irregular. Set with care, you could feel, but not quite see. These older stones are from the church foundation. Eliza bent, gloved fingers grazing a seam. 50 years buried, she said, and you'd think it was laid last week. Some prayers keep mortar from failing, Talbot offered. Some masons, I said, knew their craft. The culvert turned, then narrowed to a throat of its own. We edged along a ledge, the water below uttering a low, bronchial syllable as it met a dropped brick. Ahead, the passage opened into a chamber. The air changed without changing temperature, the way a room shifts when someone you cannot see steps into it. My lantern found just briefly. Then more certainly wood beams embedded in stone, charred at the ends. A slit of stair, half-filled, the rusty grid of an old drain, and on the far wall, a faint circle, the kind of outline left when something heavy had hung there for years and then did not. O'Rourke grunted. There, he said. There is your source a bell once hung. Somebody's found a way to make it talk again. No bell, Eliza said softly. Only the memory of its weight. The circle was ghost delicate, a paler dryness against damp stone, but it described the diameter perfectly, with the ghost of bolt holes at north and south, and the suggestion of a bracket silhouette of a yoke. Beneath it, the stone angled into what might once have been a right-of-way for a rope. The groove had been smoothed by use. That was what I measured, as a matter of habit. Where against time, time against material, I set down the lantern and took out my line. My plumb bob, my calipers. The bob kissed the floor and swung in a measured arc, a bronze teardrop against a floor slick with mineral memory. The ceiling above the circle carried soot-like thin smoke caught forever. Fire had eaten the church. Fire had not managed to devour its echo. Eliza, he said, you mentioned a motto. She leaned against the coolness of the stone that had once been the east wall of the church's basement. Her voice sounded steadier for touching it. Non revertitur, she said. It does not return. The caster's mark. Talbot stepped up close to the wall. The man had a way of making observation look like prayer. Mottos are couched words, he said. They say one thing to brass and another to men. Perhaps it was a warning to those who would listen more than they would look. Enough riddles, Reverend O'Rourke said. But there was little heat in it. He, too, put his fingers to the groove where a rope might have passed. He pulled his hand away quickly. "Hear that? Asked." At first, I thought he meant the drip of water, the municipal pulse, the draft. But then, faint as the memory of a lullaby, I felt a vibration go through the stone into my bones. Not sound. Not yet. A prelude. Something far away aligning itself with the city's midnight. We were early, it was not yet 10. Above us, gas lamps made halos that the fog slipped off. Down here, we had ours. But the stones were practicing. That was how it felt. As if the city had a choir you could not see. Wet-mouthed and ready. Throats cleared. I measured the circle, the ghostly mark, where the bell had been with my calipers. 36 inches across, give or take. A bell of that size would weigh perhaps 800 pounds, depending on its bronze composition. To hang it where we stood here, below street level, before the fill that would have meant a frame. The frame's scars were visible in the rock-like heeled stitches. Elisa walked the perimeter and found, beneath a layer of soot and algae, letters cut shallow into stone. She brushed them with a handkerchief, revealed 4 Latin words, and a date, 1836, crisp, as if they'd been cut yesterday. Her breath formed into a small silver ghost in the lantern light. As she sounded them out, not for show but for herself, vox in tenebris manet, the voice remains in the darkness. Theological sentiment, Talbot said, but his tone lacked ownership. He was listening. O'Rourke was a man made of use. He wanted a prankster, a mechanism, a culprit. He scanned the walls with a constable's stare, and then crouched to peer into the old drain. He lit a match and threw it in. Thin orange bit at black and went out. "Rats big as terriers," he said, perhaps to have a thing to blame, and boys who'd sell their souls for a headline. Eliza smiled without lifting her eyes. "We prefer to rent attention," she said. "Souls are poor collateral." Boys could not lay down the kind of resonance we felt on the street, I said, and no one could mount a bail here in secret. I sketched the room in my notebook, the circle on the wall, the groove, the staircase, bricked and the directions of the culverts. I indicated with hash marks the places where the cold felt thicker. This is how one maps what cannot be seen, with a record of where something else is weak. We made a search. It was not a dramatic affair. The room gave up mouse bones, a twisted nail, a scrap of lead flashing, 2 buttons that had sloughed their cloth long ago, and a thin sprinkling of red dust along the bottom edge of the wall that had once held the bell. It looked like paprika. When I touched it, it smudged a faint carmine on my fingertip. It smelled like nothing. "Brick dust," O'Rourke said. Eliza frowned. "Brick is redder. This is—" She held her gloved finger close. In the lantern's tilt it seemed to flicker between dull rust and something that had known heat. "Bronze, ground fine." "Filings," I said. "From what?" O'Rourke asked. "This ring," Talbot answered, touching the ghost's circle gently. "Things that do not return shed their edge on the way out, or in." He had the kind of voice that made statements without insisting you believe them. It left a space you could step into. I did not step. We rested against the walls, rationing the breath that felt cooler the closer you stood to the old marks. Elisa asked me about bell casting, and I told her what I knew from drawings bell metal, a marriage of copper and tin, the mold given shape by a false bell, inscriptions pressed into wax and then into the clay so the letters would emerge sharp, a fire's long persuasion hardening the heart of the sound. "Every bell has a personality," I said, hearing myself sound like Talbot. "It is partly mathematics, partly accident, partly the hand that strikes, and the place it rings," Eliza said. "The city it speaks into." "It is not midnight," O'Rourke said, "and yet here we are, giving poetry to a hole in the ground." He said this not unkindly. Poets get into places cannot. We ate in the way one eats, with damp air pressing on the appetite, a heel of bread, cheese that sweated, apples bitten quickly. Arlander hissed its quiet song. I checked the oil and adjusted the wick until the flame wore its small red corona again. The culvert outside the chamber ran like a road with traffic you didn't see. I did not mean to sleep, but time subsided into its own culvert, and I felt myself drift sideways rather than down. In that thin nap, I dreamed of the church above us not, as it had been drawn in city records, but as it might have looked on a winter morning when frost filigreed the windows and the bell's note braided itself with the steam of horses. I dreamed that the bell's word, the one I had not recognized in the fog above, was a name that did not belong to a person but to a place, and that when it was spoken, doors knew to open. I woke to Eliza's hand on my sleeve, and the softest pressure of stone against my back that was not new, but felt newly intimate. "Listen," she said. We listened. Somewhere farther away than our chamber, but nearer than the street, something metallic had answered something. It was not the bell. Not yet. It was the dress rehearsals. Dress rehearsal? A chain tested against its own link. A rope creaked in tissue paper growl. A clock we did not own advanced a minute. Talbot looked at the invisible ceiling and whispered, "Not a prayer, but a measurement." 2 hours, he said. Maybe less. We made plans. The way frightened people make plans, by assigning tasks, so the mind has a place to go. O'Rourke would take the left spur of the culvert to see whether it opened into another room. Elisa would stand at the seam where the old staircase met the fill and listen. Because she had the best ears, she listened for a living. Talbot would stay by the ghost of the bell and continue listening for God in the cracks. I would map, measure, and, if we found a cavity behind the wall, tap and calculate to see how far it might run. We separated. The chamber did not change shape, but the corners retreated when you weren't looking. I crouched by the wall and traced the groove with chalk, marking small hashes where the angle shifted. The chalk line looked like a spine. Primera count. Every 7 inches the groove widened slightly, as if a rope thicker at intervals had worn it. "Knots," I said aloud. "Rope keeps memory," Talbot said from across the room, and I did not argue just then because the chalk in my hand began to tremble without my fingers moving. It was the stone beneath carrying, a small tremor like the rumor of a crowd. I set my hand flat against it. The tremor did not match my pulse now. It beat a trifle slower. It was practicing being a clock. "Elisa, primera, ca, yed." "I hear it," she said. But her voice came from farther down the culvert than I expected. She had followed a sound only she could hear and ended up at a niche in the brickwork where the older stones gave way to something else would. A square cut had been made, and then covered with a panel. The panel had been limned by moisture and time until its edges almost disappeared, but if you knew the language of carpentry you could see where someone had fitted it carefully so it wouldn't swell and stick. "You should have stayed where we put you," O'Rourke told her, arriving from the other spur, but he knelt beside her and put his ear to the seam just the same. He looked like a man conversing with a door. "What do you hear?" I asked. "Not the bell," Eliza said. "Rooms, plural. It sounds like—" She stopped. I understood why. It sounded like someone breathing who had learned to do it very quietly in the dark. We should have left then. Sensible people would have marked the panel, reported it, returned in daylight, with more men and shoring beams, and the city's sense of itself in tow. But the city, above our heads, was already its own choir. The fog carried sounds and secrets between its teeth. Down here we were forehand. The panel was only a panel, and a carpenter's pride is a thin line between caution and curiosity. I wedged my chisel under the lower edge and felt the woodstone marriage resist, then yield with the slow affection of long partnerships. The panel released with a small sigh and a smell like kept books. Behind it, a short crawl space presented itself, just wide enough for a man who did not mind stone touching his shoulders. My lantern's light crawled in and drew back, as if reluctant. Beyond the crawl space, a drop. I rolled a pebble. It clicked and tapped, and came to rest with a sound that made my molars vibrate the acoustics of a larger void. "Cello under the cello," O'Rourke said. And the idea offended his training. "Under what authority?" "Under the authority of need," Talbot murmured. We argued by glances. Then Elisa did the thing none of us had the courage to do first. She took the lantern, reduced the flame, and slid into the crawl space with the careful, committed grace of someone going under thin ice. She did not go far. 2 yards, she said, her voice becoming the size of the hole. Then Dan. "Don't you dare," O'Rourke said. "I won't," she said, And for once, a reporter kept a promise. She backed out and handed me the lantern, her face paler but more certain. There's a ladder cut into the stone, steps for hands and feet, old but not broken. We brought the rope from my satchel 30 feet. Strong, smelling of tar. O'Rourke looped it about his own chest and insisted that if anyone went down, it would be him, because the city would prefer to misplace a policeman than a reporter or a clerk with a city's ear. We did not disagree. He slid through the hole and down the steps, each deliberate movement sending a small whisper of grit back up. We fed rope. After a moment that remade itself as an hour, his voice drifted up. "Room," he called. "Bigger than the one you're in. My lantern isn't reaching the far wall, but there's a draft, and the sound is stronger." We followed one by one the order, in which people trust each other, made manifest. O'Rourke below, me next because measurements are most useful at the front, Elisa careful behind me, then Talbot last, closing whatever circle we made. The second chamber was a proper roomstone dressed better than the culvert, with angles that tried to be right. The air in it did not belong to the city. It belonged to patience. My lantern found niches where candles might have been. It found a table, badly decayed, on which lay an iron object like a bell clapper without its bell. It found another of those ghostly circles on the far wall, and below it a complex of pulleys and levers so corroded they seemed sculpted out of the idea of metal rather than metal itself. I knelt by the iron clapper. It was heavy, for its scissoring is honest, that way and bore, like a thumbprint, the suggestion of a repeated touch at its end. Eliza bent close, pencil stilled. "Do bells keep ringing when you take their tongues?" she asked. "They speak backwards," Talbot said. "They are spoken into." "By what?" O'Rourke asked. I did not have an answer ready, and then I did, and I hated it. "By their place," I said. "By the shape of the room. By the way, distance is arranged. If the space is designed to receive a particular frequency, it can be excited by other means, by a heartbeat of earth." I groped for a secular example, and found none that did not feel like superstition dressed for the opera, by coincidence converging more often than it ought to. "By will," Talbot said simply. "We found, in a corner where water had not had its way, a small wooden box. It was not ornate. It was the sort of box that holds important things precisely because it appears not to. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a bronze token the size of a pocket-watch lid. Eliza took it in her palm, then passed it to me, with her eyebrows high, the reporter's signal for headline material. It was warm, though the room was cold. On one side, a casting the color of old honey, a bell in relief, elegant as a mathematical solution. On the other, words, "Nan," and beneath them a single date 1836 and a tiny maker's mark like a star that had learned to write. Around the edge, minute-cuts caught and released the light-like quiet applause. "A medal for the bail. Elisa Bray." "A key," said Talbot. "Or a promise." "Souvenir," said O'Rourke, because he needed the world to be made of things that could be stolen and sold. My fingers tingled. We all turned our heads at the same moment because the room did it for us. It pivoted toward a sound we could not yet hear. The subtle draught I had dismissed drew in and then out, as if the chamber were a lung. Far off in the city, a church bell rang 9. The sound came to us as through folded cloth. When it died, our room held its breath. The first toll began not in our ears, not yet. The stones adjusted their attention. The bronze token in my hand took back its warmth as if to arm itself. Then the sound arrived, clean and heavy and exact, as if someone had lifted a hammer in another century and brought it down in ours. It did not come from the ghost circle. It came from everywhere the old church had been. O'Rourke's face changed, without his permission. He looked like a boy who had been told a story about a wolf, and just then heard it outside. Eliza's lips parted, and for the space of a heartbeat I saw her not as a journalist, but as a girl who had once believed in miracles and then had had to stop. Talbot closed his eyes and opened them. Not for piety, but to be sure he was awake. I felt the note in my spine first, then in my throat, and then in the place just below my heart, where you can sometimes feel sorrow strike and ring. "1," Elisa said, without meaning to. The room absorbed the word. The second toll was closer, and it climbed a half-note into a space between sorrow and warning. The third did not follow seconds, so much as a pattern of breath. Inhale, strike, exhale, wait. Bt fort, we had backed instinctively against the walls, as if to lower our profiles against an invisible artillery. By the fifth, dust fell from a seam that had not shed in 50 years, and the dust wore the faintest carmine tint, as if the bronze filings had taught it a color. On the sixth, the iron clapper on the decayed table moved just a quarter inch, just enough to make a sound that was not the bell, but carried the bell's accent. It sounded like a throat-clearing in a far pew. "Who is striking?" Eliza whispered. "The city," I said, because I could imagine the gas lines acting as organ pipes, and the culverts carrying harmonics, and the brickwork offering back what it had stolen. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't sufficient. This wasn't mere acoustics. The cadence matched something alive. On the seventh, the rope groove on the wall darkened as if made wet by invisible fingers. On the eighth, the bronze token in my palm pulsed, once gently, like a living creature startled in sleep, and then lay inert and very cold. On the ninth, from the crawl space above, we heard the soft, unmistakable sound of the manhole cover sliding back into place. We looked up as one might look up at a lid closing. I pictured the crowd above, their eyes coin-bright. I pictured the fog moving its pieces across the board. I pictured the hole we had made in the panel and how neatly it would hide if someone pressed the wood back. But the sound of the manhole was not the sound of someone sealing us in malice. It was the sound of weight deciding to rest where weight belongs. It was the city settling. On the 10th, O'Rourke wrapped the rope around his forearm, as if to hold on to a fact. "This is a joke I will arrest," he said. But the kind of joke he meant did not live in rooms like this. On the 11th, Talbot's face changed. It was not conversion, and it was not fear. It was recognition. His mouth formed a single syllable I could not hear because the room did not permit anything but the bell. He leaned forward, his hand just above the groove, not touching. And in that space, his wedding bandle, gold, unremarkable, caught the lantern light and offered it back in a streak the color of bronze. On the 12th, the tone wanted to resolve into a word. And this time, it almost did. It was not English. But every person I love carries a name in a place beneath language, and the tone found that place and wrote something there. Eliza's fingers tightened on my sleeve. "It's saying," she began, and then the word was gone. The way a dream goes when you try to walk it into daylight. Silence filled the chamber like water, not absence of sound, presence of stillness, the kind of stillness that can topple men. We stood in Eton, and the rope in O'Rourke's fist moved, not by our hands. It was an inch, perhaps two, enough to make fibers complain, enough to make the groove rasp like a throat, enough to tell each of us, without need of agreement, that whatever had rung the city had moved closer. I looked at the ghost circle and for the space of a blink saw, but knew with my skin the outline of a bell that was no longer there, all its curves traced in the faintest silver. Then it was only stone. I closed my hand around the bronze token and felt, against my palm, a tiny rise along its edge I had not noticed before. Not a flaw, a notch, a place to set something to hold it still. A keyway. The 13th toll did not come. That would have been a mercy or a trick. What came instead was the sound of a step from the crawl space, patient, made by something that understood how to let weight stand upon stone without unduly waking it. Not a rat, not water. A human pace measured out in quiet. Then the whisper of a breath that was not the room's. Talbot did not turn. Eliza did. O'Rourke lifted his chin, his hand tightening on the rope, every muscle in his jaw a declaration of jurisdiction. I lifted the lantern, and the flame wore its carmine halo like a small soldier. The light went up the crawl space and met nothing. Then it met something, a scuff shoe sole that knew the city, a hem of cloth wet at the edges. Hand. The hand was ordinary, except for a thread of bronze dust along the lifeline, as if the person had put his palm against a ghost circle and come away marked. The hand paused on the edge of the hatch and then withdrew. Not retreat, restraint. "Show yourself," O'Rourke said, and the room swallowed his authority and offered it back as advice. "Who's there?" The answer was a small, measured thing that somehow filled the air. A sound like a bell would make if it had learned to breathe words. A single note, half-spoken, half-remembered, and then a whisper. Not in English, and not in Latin, but so exactly placed that each of us felt it arrive at the part of the mind that stores instructions you obey without knowing why. It was, to my engineer's ear, a code, and it ended on a cadence that did not count up or down, so much as open a door that had been waiting not above or below, but exactly where we stood. The hand on the crawlspace lip hovered, then withdrew a patient inch, as if taking the measure of our fear. I lifted the lantern higher. The flame, ringed in its small carmine halo, leaned and steadied. The crawlspace framed darkness the way a picture frame frames absence. We listened for shoes on stone. We listened for the room's quiet heart to skip. We heard only the sigh of the subterranean draught and the faint, lingering shiver left by the 12th toll. By order of the city of Boston, Sergeant O'Rourke said, voice even, "You'll show yourself and state your business." He said it to the dark. But the dark already knew our names. A measured click answered him, metal touching metal twice, then once, then 3 times again with an exactness a clockmaker might admire. Not a threat. A pattern. It matched the odd cadence we had felt thread through the bell's tolls. "It's counting," Eliza whispered. "Not time. Steps. Or letters," I said, because the engineer in me wanted code to be made of numbers that knew how to behave. 2, 1, 3. Then a paused. Again, Reverend Talbot drew closer to the ghost circle on the wall. He did not touch it. He put his hand near the groove where rope had once traveled, the way a physician holds a wrist above a pulse. "Response and call," he said. Litany. Another click from the crawl space, this time for then too. The pattern completed, like a sentence falling into place. I felt my fingers close around the bronze token, its edge finding the notch in my palm as if reminding me of the shape of a key. "Whatever you are," O'Rourke called, "you're not alone down here. Choose to be sensible." A man's voice came, and it was ordinary enough to be terrifying, not disembodied, not theatrical. "Boston, United States, in the throat of—" "Sensible would have been listening 12 nights ago," he said. His voice was 40 in the dark, and any age in daylight. Sensible would have been not tearing down a church to build a ledger. He moved into the lantern's reach-narrow face, beard like iron filings, eyes that reflected more light than they took. He wore a coat that had once been black, and now agreed to be a shade of the underground wet. At the hem, a seam mended with copper wire. Along his right hand's lifeline there was indeed a thread of bronze dust, as if that hand had pushed against the ghost of a bell until the ghost pushed back. "State your name," O'Rourke said. "Silas Bray," he answered. "I keep what the city forgets." Eliza's pencil lifted in reflex. "Your occupation, Mr. Bray." "Occupation is a surface word," he said. "Down here, I adopt functions. Up there, I mended clocks, until clocks began to lie for men." Talbot inclined his head. "Who taught you the pattern?" "The stone," Silas said simply. "And a woman who loved a bell." He would have been dismissed as a crank anywhere but where we stood. Here, the room fitted him the way an instrument fits the hand that has learned it. He glanced at the iron clapper on the ruined table, and then at the bronze token in my hand. The faintest smile moved the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, recognition. "You found her coin?" he said. "Whose?" Eliza asked. "Ann Mather," he said. "The last sacristan of St. Mather's. No relation. The name, a confusion of capitals and centuries." She rang the bell until the night the fire took the nave, and men took the rest. She kept this coin when they sold the tongue and promised never to return what the bell had carried to the poor. She called that promise theft. "Non revertitur," I said. "It does not return." He nodded, a caster's motto that became a banker's excuse. O'Rourke's patience thin but did not break. "You have been ringing this city like a glass," he said. "Why?" "To make it hear what it owes itself," Silas said. He looked at me. Not to flatter, but because he had decided I would follow a line if I saw one. "The bell is gone, but the space remembers its speech. The culverts say, Amen. The gas lines carry the consonants. The chamber corrects for loss. If you give the void a hand, it rings." "A hand," Elisa echoed softly. eye going to his palm with the bronze dust. "Pressure," Silas said, "placed where the shape needs it." At midnight, the city breathes on a larger rhythm he draws. River drops. Horses still. Men hold their breath at the edge of sleep. I listen. I answer. The room answers me back. 12 nights to teach it the tongue again. "And the pattern?" I asked. "Twice. Once. 3. Then 4. Then 2. Silas lifted his chin at the ghost circle. The bell spoke in Pescol, and response, law and mercy. "The code is the directions to the ledger they built to hide in," he said. "The real ledger, not the city's. The one they cut into stone?" Elisa stepped forward. "A ledger of what?" "Of names," he said. He said it without triumph. Of what was collected for the burned and hungry in 1836, and where it went instead. 12 trustees, 12 disbursements that did not return. Talbot closed his eyes briefly, as if counting sins was a habit he had promised to stop. "Where?" Silas moved to the wall opposite the ghost circle. The lantern showed there was no mark, only stone that had not been asked to speak. He knelt and pressed his palm against a place 2 feet from the floor, holding it there until the bronze dust along his lifeline brightened like mica. He drew a breath and released it on a cadence that mirrored the bell's inhale strike. "Exhale. Wait." Asim acknowledged him subtle, not sight so much as a change in the way the dark leaned. "Elokt Atma. Do you trust your hand?" "In some things," I said. He gestured to the coin. The notch gosiri indicated a shallow depression. I wouldn't have noticed if the lantern had been a shade dimmer. "Turneth when the room breathes out." O'Rourke stepped between us, because that was his function. "If the wall opens," he said, "what comes out?" "Not bodies," Silas said, and for all his talk of rooms and breathing, the mercy in the answer was human. "Recourse, and a gate that'll try to drown you if you do not ask. Water to wait." I heard the water again, then the slow run of the city's hidden river, the cough, where a smaller pipe fed into a larger throat. My own breath matched the room's rhythm without instruction. Eliza's hand stilled. Talbot's mouth moved around an unvoiced prayer that was more diagram than plea. We put our lives into a notch in a coin because that is what people do in rooms where stone has learned to listen. I fitted the bronze token into the shallow depression. It took, not with a mechanical click, but with a soft engagement of a word finding its rhyme. The wall's attention sharpened. I waited until the draft in the room drew in, and then turned the coin the soft half-measure Silas indicated. From somewhere below, a weight shifted. The floor did not move. The idea of the floor digged. A channel that had not carried water in years sighed. A panel the size of a door but fitted to be invisible unlocked with patience rather than speed. A smell rose a library that had learned to be a river that remembered writing. The door did not open outward. It withdrew, stone sliding against stone with the embarrassment of old joints. Beyond it lay a narrow chamber, barely wider than a coffin and twice as high, cut into rock with care and with a miser's sense of inches. Along one side, recessed into the stone, as if the wall had been made to accept them from the start, sat 12 long slabs, the size of ledgers, each under a fitted bronze cover greened at the edges. Above each, an initial had been cut. No no dates. Only a letter that would mean nothing to someone not looking and everything to someone waiting to be named. Eliza's breath fogged the air. "They built themselves a vault where a sacrament had been," she said, and her voice did not accuse. "It mourn." Charity overlaid with arithmetic. O'Rourke's jaw tightened. He wasn't a fool. He recognized a kind of crime that required more light than his badge was used to summoning. "We'll take these above," he said. "We'll drown if you lift them without the river's leave," Silas said. "The mechanism that guards them is older than the men who feared being found. It listens to pressure, not promises." "Show me," I said. "Enno dev once." The bell's room and the river share a throat. If we open the wrong ledger or all at once, the throat opens. It's a sluice. The city's blood comes through and writes one last entry. Elisa leaned over the nearest bronze cover and traced the initial with her gloved finger. Her eyes sharpened the way a species adapted in a breath. "We'll photograph," she said, voice becoming practical to save itself. "We'll copy without lifting." Her camera was upstairs with the She reached for a notebook instead, but the pencil did not touch paper. It hung, listening, because the room had drawn its breath in, and the draught had changed colder, tilted. "Not now," Silas said. "Midnight is when it speaks its clearest, and midnight has passed for tonight's lesson. We will be the room, cut him off with a sound like a fingertip circled on a glass. Suggestion of tone, promise of shatter withheld." The bronze covers hummed, faint but together, as if they had been tuned to a single vowel. I did not have to be told the mechanism had felt the panel move and was considering its response. Talbot stepped forward, more brave than we deserved. He placed his hand on the edge of the narrow chamber, not on the covers, but on the stone, and breathed on the room's rhythm, not a prayer this time, but a tuning. The hum ebbed a hair. He looked younger for that one breath. "People built this A-side softly to the stone as much as to us. People can ask it to show mercy. Mercy is a word that returns," Silas said. "Unlike money," Elisa said, and no one smiled, because humor would have broken something delicate. We closed the panel with the same careful timing, turning the coin back at the bottom of the room's exhale. The seam became wall again. The hum subsided to quiet. Somewhere far above, a wagon rolled through fog. The wheel note, a faint silver reminder that the city continued liking its own noises. "Tomorrow night," Silas said, "not because of ceremony, because the room will be ready to carry what it must carry. You will bring light that can fix the names. You will bring a second pair of hands to hold the river, if it tries us." "Who's O'Rourke?" asked. "Someone who knows doors," Silas said, with a thin smile to me. "And someone who knows the price of light," he added to Eliza. He looked at Talbot last. "And someone who can make the room believe it will be forgiven for telling us what it knows." He turned toward the crawl space, then hesitated. "Do not tell your superiors," he said to O'Rourke, and there was no insult in it, only mathematics. "They are either among the letters or sworn to preserve them. Bring a man who will risk his night's sleep." O'Rourke's face darkened a shade. "I am not in the habit of keeping city matters from the city." "You're not," Silas said. "You're in the habit of keeping the city from the men who own it. Tonight, keep the city close." He disappeared into the crawl space with the quiet skill of a man whose bones had memorized dimensions. The draught altered in his wake, and the room recovered the shape it wore when only stone and patience held it. We stood without speaking. Eliza found a pencil again and wrote 3 lines without looking down. Talbot touched the wall once more as if lodging a promise. O'Rourke unwound the rope from his arm and looked at the fibers as if they had grown while he wasn't watching. Back up the cut steps, through the panel mouth, along the culvert where the water whispered a low bronze vowel, through the first chamber with the soot that had been fire's writing. We returned to the ladder. Above, the world smelled of horses and fog and the simple arithmetic of lamps. When my head rose to street level, the fog looked thinner, but it was only that my eyes had decided to believe in distance again. The manhole slid home behind us with the sound of a lid that has learned to trust its jar. The crowd had thinned. Those who remained wore the faces of people who had stood too long in a story and needed their beds to tell them who they were. Ilia tucked her notebook away like a specimen. Talbot looked up at sky without stars. O'Rourke lit a cigarette and did not smoke it. He needed the small fire to feel like jurisdiction. "No midnight watch tonight," he said to the curious few. "Go home." They went, not because a sergeant told them to, but because the fog had decided it had seen enough faces. We stood at the corner of Charter and Blackstone as the city settled its weight into the hours between. Eliza said, "If this is true," "It is," I said. "Then the story is too large for one paper," she said, and she sounded almost apologetic, as if betrayal of column inches were a moral failing. "It must be printed everywhere, or nowhere." "Nowhere, until it can't be burned," O'Rourke said, and his eyes went across the fog, not to the precinct, but to a memory of a house that had once contained his father's pride. "Names are gunpowder." Talbot looked at me. "You have the coin?" Primera looked down. The bronze token sat easy in my palm, heavier than it ought to be. The notch dark with the room's breath. On the coin's face, the raised bell seemed, in the lamplight's silver, to hold a fraction of movement, as if struck in a tiny, private world only it could hear. "Keep it," Elisa said. "If we can't find Silas again, it will listen to you. It will listen to the room," I said. "I am only a hand that knows when to wait." We parted like conspirators who did not yet know the shape of their conspiracy. Eliza vanished into the fog with the confidence of someone who obeyed streets the way a villain obeys a bow. Talbot returned to a parish not his own, carrying a silence he would have to translate for a god who prefers daylight. O'Rourke and I walked the first block together. He said nothing for a time, then asked a question as simple as a click from the crawlspace. If the names include men with badges, he said, do we tell them to the fog and ask it to carry the sound? We tell them to stone, I said. It remembers better. He nodded once and peeled off down an alley that had trained him young. I slept badly. In the half-hour before dawn, a train sounded across the river, and the note found the place under my breastbone where the bell had written its almost word. I rose to a room that had the decency to be my own. The coin lay on the table. It looked dull and deeply content, like a tool that knows its one good trick. At noon, Boston wore another day like a coat it had worn yesterday. Fogged, workmanlike, secretly listening. Eliza sent a boy to me with a note so brief it seemed a cipher. Bring the coin at 11. Bring no one else, unless you are sure of their ears. The boy waited for no answer. Boys do not wait. They are answers. At dusk, the lamplighters again made their quiet constellations, and the city's grates exhaled. I put the coin in my pocket, and found the municipal key heavy beside it. The weight made a logic I could believe in. At 10:50, I met O'Rourke and Talbot at the corner, without having agreed to. We had agreed last night. Our feet remembered. The street was less crowded. The fog was not less. We lifted the manhole like men, testing whether a door has decided to be a wall. Under the city, the culverts hummed in their sleep. The first chamber welcomed and warned. The crawlspace panel remembered our touch and pretended not to. The second chamber held still until we breathed on its measure. Silas Bray was already there, as if the room had built him. He had brought a length of chain that caught the lantern's light and returned it as a muted pageant of silver. For the gate, he said, if the river thinks it will right us. Eliza arrived last, having found a lamplighter's boy to relay a Camerit's plates wrapped in care, its mechanics clean as a She set it down with the tenderness of someone placing a sleeping child where morning will find it. Tonight, Silas said, we lift one cover. We listen to the room. If it speaks flood, we teach it wait. If it speaks names, we let them be written. Etornet to me your hand. I fitted the coin to the wall again and listened with my body. The room breathed in. We waited. It breathed out. I turned. The seam admitted us. The narrow chamber received the lantern's light and made it smaller. The bronze covers lay like sleeping tablets. The initial J waited like a dare. Eliza set the camera. O'Rourke took the chain's end in his fist. Talbot laid his palm to stone. On the room's exhale, Silas whispered. We lifted. The cover rose a half-inch. The chamber's draft altered cooler, faster. The sluice mechanism somewhere below flexed its thought. The river in its throat gathered itself like a sentence about to begin. Hold! Talbot breathed, matching the room's rhythm with a countermeasure that sounded like an apology he would be willing to live with. The draft paused. The sluice reconsidered. We raised the cover another inch. Beneath it lay paper and lead and the faintness of ink that had once thought itself permanent. The top sheet bore a heading cut with an engraver's care and a handwriting so clean it could curdle milk. It said, Relief for the Dispossessed, St. Mather's Parish, 1836. It said, Trustees, present. It said these boursements. The river took one breath, as if to speak, and then held. Eliza's shudder touched the air with a soft brass kiss. And from somewhere, not in our room, and not entirely in our century, the bell that wasn't there gave a single, perfect, silver note that wrote itself into the bones of the stone and into the part of my mind where instructions become law. We had time to make one choice. We chose to read. The heading on the first page shone with the dull pride of careful ink. Relief for the Dispossessed, St. Mather's Parish, 1836. Beneath, the names of trustees marched in orderly ranks initials, with polite flourishes, as if shame could be persuaded to wear a collar. The list on the left-hand margin began with J. Elisa, angled the camera. Breath measured to the room's slow tide. The shutter whispered. O'Rourke held the loop of chain taut. forearm roped with effort, ready for the sluice to think about waking. Talbot laid his hand flat on the stone, a man listening through bone. Silas stood beyond the lantern's circle, where the dark kept confidences. His eyes fixed not on the paper but on the draft he could feel the water decide. I read, because someone had to give voice to what the stone already knew. Truste EJ. Disbursement $240. Coal and bread for the winter poor. Recipient signature. I wanted that to be in Mather. The hope died given the next line. Transferred same day to Cobb and Hanley, for safekeeping against fire. A calm flourish followed. Returned non-revertitur. The Latin sat in the Boston ink like a stain. Returned where? Elisa whispered. To the safe that ate, Silas said. We turned the page with a joint caution that felt like prayer. The room exhaled. We took its permission. Receipts marched by, their numerals precise. 24 milk, 15 for candles, 100 for blankets. Each ended with the same grave echo. Transferred for safety, returned to silence. The ledger's hand had no tremor. The lies had steadied it. At the bottom of the 5th page, a notation in a different nib balked the rhythm. The strokes were quicker, the ink darker where the pen had pressed. If this be found, the bell will have kept faith longer than men. No signature, only a small mark, like a star that had learned to write. The same caster's mark stamped on the coin in my pocket. Eliza stopped the shutter and pressed her lips together to keep from speaking the name that was on Tepache. She did not have to. We were all thinking it. Anne, the woman who had loved a bell and refused to return what was meant for the poor. O'Rourke shifted his grip. The chain answered with a quiet complaint. How much? He said. And it wasn't to me. Silas did an arithmetic he'd done in the dark long ago. If each letter kept what it could and taught the next to take a little more, 12 men carried off a winter. Maybe 2. Boston, United States, does not like to think of itself as a thief. It prefers industry and improvement and neat brick. The fog above our heads, which owned no ledgers, pressed closer as if to hear. We photographed until the plates were spent. Eliza waited for the room's exhale before each exposure, matching the shutter to the chamber's pulse, the way a musician joins an orchestra. The sluice sulked, but did not open. Talbot's steady palm and Silas's small corrections of breath taught it patience. I read until the names became patterns, and the patterns made a shape of wrongdoing so tidy it would have pleased a schoolmaster. J appeared again and again. Sometimes the hand grew bolder and omitted the pretense no coal and bread, only trustees' discretion. One entry listed loan to the choir school, and, beside it, a figure that would have bought an organ. The choir school had never been built. Look there, Elisa said suddenly, and put her pencil to the margin 2 pages back, where my eye had not lingered. In the gutter of the binding, a tiny triangle of paper, lifted deliberate, like a turned-down ear. She teased it free with her glove and unfolded a square no bigger than a matchbox. The same quick hand as the earlier note had pressed a single line. When the bell is gone, do not return the sound. Let the sound return you. Talbot read it 3 times, lips shaping the words, meaning arriving like light, arriving through fog slower than you guess, then all at once. The bell is a guide, he said, not an instrument. It is the city that must be struck. You would ring the city with names, O'Rourke asked, stubborn because hope is dangerous. Name a dozen men at midnight. Watch the fog deliver warrants. Not warrants, Silas said. Witness. We replaced the bronze cover on J, inch by inch, cupping the room's mood as if it were a fragile lamp. The hum in the stone subsided. The draft went from alert to merely watchful. We closed the narrow chamber with the coin at the bottom of the exhale and let the seam be stone again. The silence that followed was not the empty kind. It was the sort that clears a table. Tomorrow we lift 2, Eliza said, already rationing light for names yet unsaid, or 1.5, enough to prove a pattern. If we lose this to water or men, we still hold the truth. Tomorrow, Silas said, and then another tomorrow. But your tomorrows are fewer than you think. He led us back into the first chamber, and the suit that had learned to be permanent watched us. The culvert whispered its secular psalm. We climbed the ladder, like men who had agreed to share a secret with stone. On the street, in the midnight fog, Boston performed its old trick of pretending nothing had happened underground. A horse snorted and shook the dull bronze of his harness. A drunk hummed a tune with no notes. A lamplighter's boy dragged his pole like a spear. The manhole slid home with a contented hush. "Who is Jota?" Eliza asked when we were alone at the corner of Charter and Blackstone, the fog making a room of the night. "If we say Jeremiah Cobb, half the wharf will shrug. If we say Judge Josiah Halley, we will not say yet." O'Rourke cut in. "Not until we can make the city hear it is true. Our work is a metronome now," Talbot said. "We must keep the count." We parted again, the city turning us out into its grey corridors. I slept badly and woke worse. The bell's almost word lodged like a seed behind my breastbone. The day wore its usual coat. Men bought bread. Boys ran messages across damp squares. Women barter-worried the price of coal. The fog never lifted. It simply learned the hours. At noon, a note found me in my municipal office paper that smelled faintly of oil and the brass dust of a clock. The ink was fast, the hand small. "You are being watched," it said. The man with the silver knob cane made the rounds of all the precincts. "Do not come by the same route twice." It was unsigned. The paper bore faint, as a watermarker, same caster's star. I burned the note and memorized the ashes. At dusk, Boston's gas lamps lit their bronze halus, and I walked the longest way to the corner. O'Rourke arrived with a face that had learned a new habit. Caution without the armor of uniforme ad, no hat. He had cut his badge from his coat and pinned it inside. "The commissioner asked after me," he said, and spit the title quietly into the fog. "He asked whether I was following up a complaint from the ward about vagrants under the street. He asked if I had spoken with Miss Hart. He asked if I still had my mother's rosary." "And do you?" Talbot asked. "I keep it with my sense of humor," O'Rourke said, and almost smiled. Eliza appeared last, the camera wrapped in a shawl as if it were a sick child. "2 men watched my building," she said, without drama. "Broad hats. The kind that does not drip. They left when the lamplighter came, so as not to become part of his story. Silas was waiting below. He did not ask about our routes. The room had counted our steps and found them acceptable. We moved through the first chamber and into the second with the care of men carrying a sleeping whirl. "We lift H," Elisa said. "Quick. If Hale's hand is here, we simply cannot unread it." "Or C," O'Rourke countered. "If Cobb is our petty thief, we do not spend our only light on the high priest. The river loves appetite. It will try to right us if we reach too far. Then we lift one and listen," I said. "We take what the room will give." The coin entered the notch, and the seam withdrew on the room's exhale. The bronze tablets breathed their dull Eliza's fingers hovered over H, and then moved to C. Then back to H. "If we blink, we lose 2 months," she said. "I can feel the story moving faster than paper." "We lift H a hair," Silas said. "We listen. If the sluice grows jealous, we put H to sleep and see if the room takes offense both times. We leave with our names still in our mouths." We lifted H the width of a thumbnail. The room warmed by a degree that was not temperature attention more than heat. The sluice gathered. Talbot leaned his apology into the stone. The water considered it, and swayed. Beneath the cover, the faintest tremble passed, like a held breath shaken by a name. We raised H, another fraction. The river's thought sharpened, but held. Eliza slid a plate into place. The top page bore the heading H, and there, in a hand that had learned to be careless with his own righteousness, Judge J. Hell Advance, for the relief of widows, to be verified. Beside it, a large, proud sum. Beneath those smaller notations in a different hand, the quick hand again, the ink darker at the turns. No widows named, no receipts filed. Eliza's shudder breathed. O'Rourke stared at the word judge, as if it might go away if he offered it an exit. It did not. It strapped itself to the page, and to him. The sluice tightened, offended by our audacity. Talbot's palm trembled on the stone. Silas's cheek went hollow with controlled breath. The chain in O'Rourke's fist sang a threadbare silver. The room prepared a word that was not mercy. "Enough," I said. "We have the image." We lowered H in stages, as if laying a child back down into a fever that had briefly broken. The cover kissed stone. The hum eased. The draft softened. The room did not forgive us. It permitted us. "See now," Eliza said, and the desire in her voice was the exact measure of the dangers he wanted too much. Still, she was right. A judge alone would be a head with no tail. The city would say the story had no body. We needed the pattern of theft from clerk to bench. We moved to see the room shifted, the way a sleeper grows wary when you lean too close. We lifted only a breath. The sluice stirred. A swallow of water somewhere far along the culvert answered, curious, like a child waking. Beneath the cover, the first page waited with a patience that made my lungs hurt. We lifted a hair more. The sluice drew itself like a bow. "Hold!" Tubbett whispered. Softer than fog, the draft paused on the lip of action. I remembered the tiny paper in the margin. "When the bell is gone, do not return the sound. Let the sound return you." We had been treating the chamber like a safe. It was listening for a hymn. "Wait," I said, and before any of them could argue, I took the bronze token from the wall and laid it flat upon the top of C, metal on metal. It felt like blasphemy and like a benediction. The coin warmed. The cover's hum altered down a fraction toward a note that would not wake water. Silas smiled, small and involuntary. "She taught you," he said, meaning Anne, meaning the coin's history, citing in my palm. The room speaks through a bell once removed. We lifted C another inch. The sluice did not answer. Beneath lay the tidy handwriting of a banker who had never expected to be read in a room like this. Cobb and Hanley listed 3 times. A receipt from a carpenter for repairs to basement, the sum too large for honest planks. A notated phrase I could not keep from saying aloud because the room wanted to hear it. Conduit improvements. The words seemed innocent in the Boston way. Here they were a confession. Someone had cut stone to build this vault and then paid himself to hide it. On the bottom of the page, in the quick hand, "The bell will not return what you have taken, but you may yet return yourselves." Eliza's shudder drank the moment. We closed C, placed the coin back into the wall's notch, and let the seam become stone. We had 2 names beyond doubt, and a pattern the city would pretend to doubt until the city could not. It was not enough. It was more than men like our commissioner would tolerate. We should have left. Instead, we lingered, men who had mistaken permission for safety. That is when the chamber changed its mind. The draft reversed cool to colder. Slow too fast without waiting for our breath. The stone underfoot went from patient to alert. From the crawl space above came the measured click we had learned as codewise. Once, 3, but it did not finish. The last click was swallowed by a heavier sound. A boot. Silas's head snapped toward the hatch. He put one finger to his lips and then moved without sound, sliding to the shadow beside the opening. O'Rourke stepped forward into the light. He did not draw his revolver. The room would not tolerate a spark. Elisa lifted the camera by its strap as if it were a child she would not let fall. 2 shapes descended the hand-cut steps with the confidence of men whose days had taught them ownership. The lantern met their hats broad-brimmed, dry, the fog beating and slipping off, as if even moisture did not dare to stay long. The first carried a cane whose silver knob held a tiny engraved bell. The second wore the scowl of a man who likes to be mistaken for muscle until it's too late. The man with the cane smiled into our light with practiced warmth. "Good evening," he said, as if calling on a neighbor. "Commissioner Alden Graves, City of Boston, United States. You've saved me a damp crawl." O'Rourke did not salute. The chain in his hand gleamed like a quiet warning. "We are here on municipal inspection," he said. "The matter is delicate." "I adore delicate matters," Graves said. He glanced past us to the seam that was now merely wall. His eyes noted the scratch of metal on bronze, the suit's disturbance, the soft cloud our breath made when we spoke. He did not hurry. He did not need to. "Miss Hart," he added, nodding to Elisa, "your editor will be grateful you brought your camera somewhere a flood might happen. The flood would improve your reputation. Eliza said, calm. He smiled more. You mustn't try to write my lines for me. Talbot stepped a little in front of the wall, without seeming to. Silas, still in shadow, held his breath so expertly the room forgot about him. Graves lifted the cane. The silver knob caught the lantern, and made a little theatre of light upon the stone. I admire men who go where the maps end, he said, but the city cannot tolerate private citizens handling municipal mechanisms. It would be untidy if something turned and drowned you. The inquiry would be a nuisance. What do you want? Primera, ask it. The coin in my pocket had learned my hand well enough to press its notch into my palm without instruction. The chamber's draught leaned toward the commissioner's breath, as if to smell what kind of man he was. What I always want, A sighed softly, order, and the courtesy of being warned before a bell rings into a room of sleeping men. He tapped the knob of the cane against the wall at a height that had once been the bottom of the bell's arc. He tapped twice, then once, then three. His mouth made a tiny flourish on the last. He knew the code. The room did not answer him. It would not be spoken to by silver. He seemed unsurprised. "You've found a key," he said, letting his gaze linger just long enough on my coat. "Bring it to my office tomorrow. Noon will do. If you refuse, I will send men to fetch it before midnight, and the men I send will not listen to rooms." Oroke's voice was low. "And if the key is already with the press?" Graves looked past him, through him, at Eliza. "Then Miss Hart will discover that a paper can drown as neatly as a man. Ink runs." He smiled again, the way a teacher smiles at a child who will be sorry later. "I sympathize with your zeal, but the city prefers its charity to be silent." He put his hat back on with the affectionate precision of a man who enjoys his own silhouette. The muscle turned without having spoken. Their boots judged the hand-cut steps, then were gone. The draft, which had leaned their way warily, released a breath like a horse after a strange touch. We did not move. When we did, it was because the room's attention let us. Eliza rapped the camera slowly, as if betting a fever. Talbot lifted his hand from the wall and left no trace. Silas came back into our circle and looked at me, not asking, knowing the key would not go to any office at noon. "We ring the city," he said. "How?" O'Rourke demanded. Every syllable a risk he was willing to take. "We cannot be everywhere. If Graves knows the code, he knows the crawl. If he knows the crawl, he knows the hour. The bell has taught the room," Silas answered. "The room can teach the city. When midnight comes, we give the void a hand, and the stone will put a word in every wall that remembers St. Mather's. Not the names. Not yet. A sentence to wake the sleepers." "What sentence?" Eliza asked, voice small for the first time since I had met her. She had a room full of plates, and no way to keep them from burning. I felt the notch of the coin and the seat of the bells almost whirred behind my ribs. The fog in my mind thinned just enough to make a path. "Let the sound return you," I said, and the chamber approved with a warmth that was not heat. "Tomorrow night," Silas said, "before he can bring his men, we will have between midnight and their boots. And if the room decides it is tired of mercy, Talbot, Askad, then we drown honest," O'Rourke said, and looked none of us in the eye because he meant it. We left the chamber to its patience and the culvert to its quiet vowels. Above, Boston's fog wore the lamps like small promises. We stepped into the kind of night that leaves no footprints. Across the street, a figure with a silver knob on his cane paused where the nave would have been, tipped his hat to no one, and vanished into grey. I slept, if I slept, with the weight of the coin in a dish by my bed, and the small knowledge that tomorrow the city would either hear itself or become very good at pretending it couldn't. The bell's almost word moved in the dark like a fish changing depths sometimes near the surface of knowing, sometimes so deep my bones ached. Boston, United States, held its breath. So did we. The city loved order. The city loved secrets. At midnight tomorrow we would ask it which love was larger. Morning wore a sullen iron and did not speak. Noon pretended. Boston, United States, arranged its carts and its tempers and went about the polite theft of time. By dusk, the fog returned like a habit. I put the bronze coin in my pocket with a tenderness I would not admit, and buttoned my coat against a draft that seemed to originate inside my bones. We did not say where to meet. The corner of Charter and Blackstone set it for us. O'Rourke came from the north, hatless, jaw set. Eliza came from the south, camera wrapped like contraband scripture. Reverend Talbot arrived, carrying nothing but breath, measured to an invisible choir. Silas emerged from the fog, the way a word arrives in the mouth when you've finally earned it. Noon. Asked me. Graves kept his office warm for a key he did not receive. I said, he will come with men who do not listen. Then we must be done before men replace listening with orders, Eliza said. And for the first time a thread of fear colored her certainty. It did not make her smaller. It made her quicker. The manhole lid rose with the sigh of old iron coaxed, not forced. The ladder accepted us. The culvert breathed out. The first chamber welcomed and warned. The crawl space was a dark mouth that had learned our names. We carried lanterns trimmed to carmine halos, and a coil of chains stiff with cold. I carried, besides the coin, 2 small wedges and a carpenter's sense of leverage. Silas stopped us in the old nave's shadow, where Soot had learned patience. We will not only ring the room tonight, he said, we will teach it to cast the sentence into the city's veins. Gas is not only flame, it is a lung. The pipes want to sing. He gestured to the low hum behind the walls. The hush of the hidden river. The culverts will carry consonants. The brick will remember vowels. We will place our hands where the shape asks. I am an officer of the law, O'Rourke muttered, purely to remind himself, and this is the dampest treason I have ever attempted. Talbot's mouth twitched. There is no law against telling the truth to stone. In the second chamber, the room listened for us before we made a sound, the way a creature in the dark learns the footfalls of those who bring either food or harm. The seam admitted us. At the bottom of its breadth, the bronze covers lay quiet as sleeping tablets. The coin entered its notch with a recognition that felt almost like relief. We are not lifting tonight, Eliza whispered, reading our hunger to pry another name. We are delivering a sentence. Silas nodded. He produced from his coat a small packet wrapped in cloth. Inside lay filings bronze, fine as dust collected. Who knew how, from the ghost circle's floor, from the notch of the coin, from time itself. He pinched a whisper of the dust between thumb and forefinger and breathed across it. It sparked no light, but the room's attention tilted like a compass. Once, Anne traced this along the groove, and taught the stone to know her. He said, tonight we trace 5 places. 5, I asked, already mapping the chamber in my head. Ghost circle, rope groove, valve mouth of the sluice, seam of the ledger wall, and the opening to the crawl space. Here, where the bell once was, Silas said, touching the faint circle with a reverent finger. Here, where the rope wore its prayer. Here, he moved to the low throat in the floor, where the sluice might wake. Here, he lifted his hand to a patch of brick, where the culvert's echo drummed soft. And here, he pressed his palm a breath to the left of the seam itself. The city is not made of one thing. Neither is a voice. O'Rourke took the chain's end and fashioned it around the sluice handle. The metal a dull silver snake in the lantern light. If the river grows ambitious, I grow stubborn. He braced his boots. I could hold this until morning if I had to. You won't, Talbot said gently, and laid his hand to the stone where the draft moved. He measured us with his breath. But you will hold it long enough to teach Mercy a longer note. Elisa fixed her camera in the alcove where she could see us and the seam and whatever the room decided to show that might later be called proof. She had no plates to waste, only a single one kept clean, because tonight was not about images. It was about writing into the city's ear. Silas lifted a pinch of bronze dust and traced it in a thin pale line along the rope groove. Do not return the sound. A sighed softly, as if reminding a friend of an old instruction. Let the sound return you. He placed another whisper of dust along the edge of the ghost circle. He set a third where brick met the culvert, just at the point where drip became word. With each placement, the draft altered a fraction, as if the room were nodding. May I? Talbot asked. Silas offered him the packet. The priest took a pinch and touched it to the seam's edge, then to the lip of the sluice's valve. He spoke no prayer. He breathed timing. The bronze dust caught our lanterns like frost. Midnight, above us, was a theory. Here, It arrived as an agreement. The chamber drew in. We did not. Silas lifted the hand that had learned the room, spread his fingers, and pressed his palm to the groove. At the precise measure the bell would have chosen to speak, the first syllable entered the stone-like light entering fog. Not bright, but everywhere at once. It was not the bell's almost word. It was our sentence, made flesh in brick and water and gas. The word moved out, along the culverts, into the pipes, under the streets, through basements where coal slept and pantries hung their breath. Somewhere above, a child turned over toward the wall for comfort and felt the wall exhale. O'Rourke tightened his grip as the sluice considered joy. The chain sang once, a quiet bronze whisper. "With me," he said through his teeth, and the room agreed. Silas pressed again. The next syllable, Trabalda. Short corridor, a quick step. The Talbot adjusted his hand. The river paused the way a horse will if a voice it trusts says gently, "Steady." Eliza's eyes shone, and in the lantern's poor silver I saw the reporter. She would be in the memory of the city, the one who had helped teach Brick to speak. Return came third, longer, a word with muscle. It strode down pipes, throbbed in valves, rested its weight on cellar shelves. In a bakery 2 streets away, a cooling tray shook softly, and nobody heard because the baker had gone to dream of the price of flour. On a wharf, a rope vibrated minutely against its bollard, and remembered for a breath the feel of a ship that had sailed before its time. In a tenement a woman at the edge of sleep felt her pillow hum like a throat learning a hymn. "You." Silas breathed into the groove, and the room carried the pronoun like a mirror. It was not an accusation. It was an address. The city heard itself, named. Above, the fog tightened its grip on the gas lamps, until their halos were rings cut from tarnished silver. The note did not become loud. It became exact. Every wall that had ever known the bell took one step closer to memory. "Again," Silas said, sweat cold on his temple, a bronze glint under the grime on his palm. He pressed, and we pressed with him. Hand, chain, breath. "Let thee return. You." The sentence traveled farther, faster, learning its route. It found the iron bones of the drawbridge and made them think for a heartbeat of an oath taken and misplaced. It ran along the seam of a courthouse basement wall and set a pattern there that paper would later envy. It searched out the slim, Secret Service corridor behind the commissioner's office and drew a line on the inside of the wood where he liked to rest his cane. Graves, I thought, and the room made no objection to the thought, traveling with the sentence like a small sharp pebble in a shoe. On the third iteration, the sluice tried to wake in earnest. Water gathered its skirt with an offended hiss and leaned its weight toward us. O'Rourke's shoulders bunched. The chain held. The draught fell colder by a knife's edge. Talbot's mouth moved not words, but a counter-rhythm the room could use to change its mind about drowning men. Eliza stepped forward as if to help with the hands, then stepped back because the help required was not of that kind. "Almost," Silas said. "The city is almost listening to itself. We were not alone." From the crawlspace above, softer than caution but sharper than chance, came the scuff of boot leather on cut stone. One step, two, then a brief metallic kiss as a cane's silver lip found rock and "Time," Commissioner Graves said, his voice a silk glove on an iron hand, "the only currency that spends itself, whether you have the key or not." He descended with a man who was not the muscle from the first night. This one wore a bookkeeper's hands and a chawyer boy's hair, and his eyes had decided their color would be duty. Graves's hat crouched on his head like a crow. The silver knob on his cane hadn't unless the lantern light been polished since last we saw it, the tiny engraved bell bright as spite. "Good evening again," he said. "You've taught the dark a sentence. Clever. But I have brought men who can teach a sluice a single word. Open." The bookkeeper moved to the wall as if to pat a horse. He did not touch. He listened with his eyes. Silas did not speak to him. He looked at Graves. "The city will remember this," Silas said. "It will," Graves said. "It will remember that order prevailed." Eliza stepped between the commissioner and the seam so lightly she did not offend the room. "Order has nothing to fear from proof," she said, "unless order is built on theft. Graves's smile had a bronze edge. "Miss Hart, if paper were a sluice, one twist of a valve would clear my morning of you. The city cannot abide hysteria." He turned to O'Rourke. "Sergeant, you may leave now with a reputation intact. Officers earn the right to be mistaken once." O'Rourke's arms were rope and chain and refusal. "I'll leave when the room says you're done talking," he said, not unkindly. Graves raised the cane to tap the wall twice. Once. 3. The room ignored the silver. He altered tactic, pivoted to the bookkeeper. "Mr. Paxley," he said, as if asking for a pen. The gate Paxley regarded the sluice handle with the distance men keep from tools that can disobey. He reached, not for the chain, but for a wedge in his pocket-hoke, planed fine. He meant to lift the handle beyond O'Rourke's range, with leverage the sergeant could not answer. "Now?" Silas said. "Not to us, but to the stone." He pressed his palm into the groove with a love that had nothing of mercy in it, only fidelity. I laid my hand over his and pressed harder. Talbot found the room's exhale, and rode it like a captain, riding a swell. The sentence left our hands, and became the chamber's own. "Let the return you." It went everywhere at once. The pipes took it like instruction. The culverts accepted it like news. It found the thin sliver spaces behind stairways and learned to whisper up through floorboards. It entered houses through walls and did not knock. In a boarding house, a street away, a laundress woke and put her ear to plaster, and heard not language but a direction. "Bring back." In the commissioner's service corridor, the sentence drew itself along wood that remembered ash and fir, then flowed under the door and up into the room where the silver knob cane liked to preside. It wrote itself in dust, where the maid would see it by morning and think it was a pattern she had always missed. Graves felt it. He frowned. It was not fear yet. Fear believes in equal adversaries. It was annoyance that the room dared choose a voice that was not his. "Open it," he said. "Patience gone!" Paxley wedged the handle. Wood against iron, a lever to undo a man. The sluice bowed to physics, even as it disliked the mathematics. Water surged its shoulders forward, with a low, hungry grunt. "Hold," O'Rourke said to the chain, and to himself. The lynx bit his palm in a script of pain that would not scab until tomorrow. The handle lifted a degree. Water found a word it had been longing to say for a century, and laid the first syllable on the stones. Talbot leaned his whole soul into the wall. "Wait," he whispered to the room, and by extension to the water, and by extension to us. "There is a better use for your strength." He did not mention God. He mentioned patience, that harder prayer. "Let me," I said to O'Rourke, and took my small wedges from my pocket, one under the chain's bite, one against the lip of the handle. I am, at my core, a man of levers. I altered the angle of force. The handle surrendered the degree it had stolen. The sluice found it could not quite pronounce open. Graves's face flattened. It was a lover's face, when refused to dance. He lifted the cane as if to strike the mechanism, then remembered light, and he did not share a city with sparks. He did not move. Power hates stillness. It does not control. "Eliza," Silas said, "eyes on the draft. Can you write without paper?" She understood before he finished. She put her hand to the dusty edge of the seam. With the camera's strap wrapped around her wrist, she traced 4 words, without lifting her finger. "Let the return you." She paused where the missing word would go. The room breathed in. She breathed out. She wrote sound and felt the letters take like seeds, pressed into wet soil. The chamber warmed by a sigh. The sentence completed itself in 100 places at once on cellar bricks, on the underside of a pew in a church that had survived another fire, on the tarnished back of a mirror in a house that thought it was safe. It was not graffiti. It was instruction. It would fade like fog, and then return like tide. Paxley, sweat at his temples, tried another degree of the handle. The chain replied with a loop of refusal. O'Rourke's breath ripped in his throat once, then found its pace. Talbot's lips moved on a rhythm only. The chamber was meant to hear. Silas pressed his palm into the groove, and held his hand there as if bargaining with an old friend who needed the last word. Graves lowered the cane. His eyes found me, my hand over Silas's, the coin in my pocket, printing its notch into my palm. "You are not a man the city will remember," he said. Quiet. "But you can be a man it forgets painlessly." Keys. banis. Keys return, I said. Because the sentence had entered me. He glanced up toward the crawl space. Footsteps shook the dust, more men descending, boots that had not learned to listen. We had seconds, perhaps less. Graves saw that we had taught the room to speak in places he could not police. His mouth became a thin, bronze line. "Flood them out," he said to Paxley. "Almost tender." "Now," Silas said again, and this time not to the room, to me, to all of us. The last, we pressed. "Let the return you." The chamber drank the sentence and poured it into the city with a precision that made my bones sting. Above us, a dozen walls exhaled at once. A baker woke. A laundress put her ear to plaster. A policeman 2 wards over dropped his cigarette and waited for a word he did not know he had been promised. The fog took the sentence in its small silver teeth and carried it down alleys and up stairwells where no gas ever burned. Paxley's wedge slipped in his sweating hand. The handle bucked. O'Rourke's chain sang louder, and I thought I caught in the thread of that sound. The tiniest how many a second chain pulled opposite. Someone in another chamber, in another part of the city, holding a sluice against a story. Perhaps Anne had taught more than one room. Graves took a step backward toward the crawl space. Less retreat than rehearsal for exit. He tipped his hat, not because he was a gentleman, but because he enjoyed punctuation. "Midnight is over," he said. "Dawn is an excellent eraser. It is also a very good reader," Eliza said, and lifted the camera's dark cloth for one last exposure that fixed not names but faces, ours and his, half-lit and silvered by an underground lamp. Boots reached the lip of the opening. Shadows pressed, impatient. The room, which had humored us and argued with us and finally made common cause, made a decision. It did not open the sluice. It did not lock the scene. It did what bells do when struck correctly. It held the note. The draft hovered on the edge of action, and then, "Wait it! Go!" Silas said, voice suddenly older. "Take the sentence with you. Spread it up where the fog can pass it hand to hand. The city will be ready to return itself at dawn if the sound keeps walking." We moved. O'Rourke unwound the chain with the care of a man lowering a sleeping child. Talbot released his palm from the wall as if withdrawing a promise he intended to honor tomorrow. Eliza caught the camera to her chest and became a smaller shadow. I took the coin from its notch and pocketed it, and the seam accepted Stone's old obligation to be We reached the crawl space as Graves's men reached it from the other side. Eyes met in the small space between. No one spoke. In the tightness, the fog of our breaths hung like a small gray flag. Behind us, the chamber hummed the sentence, one more time, low and wide, into the bones of the city. We climbed. The culvert's whisper escorted us. The ladder rose like a promise we had to keep with our arms. Street-level gaslight, hallows faint as coins in ash, Boston holding itself very still. We slid the manhole into place and stood on it. In the quiet, a wall across the way breathed, and in a landlord's upstairs office, letters appeared in a strip of dust along the wainscot. Ilyasa looked at me and smiled without turning her head. "Walk!" O'Rourke said. "Not together." We separated into the fog, each carrying the sentence in our ribs. At the first corner, a lamplighter paused to rest his paw, frowned at the brick near his shoulder, and read quietly. "Let the sound return you." He said it aloud once, not knowing why, and a woman at a window heard him and whispered it to her own wall. The air took it. It traveled. It learned the quickest routes, the way water does. Behind us, under us, the commissioner's men found a silent chamber that would not obey their boots. In his office, on his polished desk, Graves would lay his cane across a paper and discover a fine line of bronze dust along the grain, as if the wood had learned to carry a bell. Dawn would come, and the city, which loved order and secrets, would be asked which love was larger. By dawn in Boston, United States, the fog was the color of cooled iron, and the city had learned a sentence. It moved mouth to mouth, brick to brick, along stairwells and shop walls and the undersides of tables. Let the sound return you. Tenants found it in dust and spoke it aloud without knowing why. A baker said it to his oven door, a lamplighter to a lamppost, a clerk to a ledger he'd never read, and the city Stavan, practical, fond of secrets, began to bring things back. Bundles appeared on church steps and precinct counters, receipts once mislaid, promissory notes kept for safety, a choir school draft that smelled of old varnish, a carpenter's bill for conduit improvements tied with twine. Eliza printed what she could and hid what she must, the first plates drying like winter leaves behind her stove. O'Rourke walked a ward he no longer pretended to own, and watched men discover that stone could remember more accurately than they did. Reverend Talbot stood in an unlit nave, and listened to the hush learn a better prayer. At noon, Commissioner Graves found the sentence feathered into the grain of his desk, where the cane rested. He brushed and could not remove it. Anything sufficient to scour the words would scar the wood. By evening he took ill with the sort of fever that never quite breaks, the kind cured only by daylight and names. We returned the coin to the underground seam, and felt the chamber accept it like a lock, consenting to be itself. The bronze covers lay quiet, but not with the silence of hoarded truth, with the poise of a voice that knew its measure. We closed the seam at the bottom of the room's breadth, and left the city to finish speaking. That night the bell did not ring, not because it had fallen silent, but because Boston had learned to carry its own note-gas lines and culverts and stairwells, holding a single, steady tone you could feel in your ribs if you were still. Nan revertitur no longer meant what the thieves had meant it to mean. The money might not return, the men might not, but the sound had, and it had brought the city with it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more dark and mysterious tales. And don't forget to like this video.